It is now my pleasure to introduce our second keynote speaker, Dr. Mitch Prinstein. Is the John Van Seters Distinguished Professor of Psychology and Neurosciences at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he co-directs the Winston National Center for Technology and the Developing Mind. A leading expert in adolescent mental health, Dr. Prinstein has spent more than 25 years studying how peer relationships, both offline and online, influence depression, self-injury, and other risks. He's a board-certified clinical psychologist, author of over 250 scientific publications and 12 books, and a trusted advisor to the White House Surgeon General, CDC, WHO, and major technology companies. Mitch is regularly featured, as many of you probably know, as an expert in psychological science and as a repeat witness testifying before the U.S. Senate in 2 TED Talks and within hundreds of media appearances around the world in outlets such as the New York Times, NPR, 60 Minutes, the Times at UK, CNN, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Today, he will help us understand the potential effects of digital media use on neural development, list different ways that technology use may influence psychological adaptation, and help us learn concrete strategies to enhance development with social media and protect children from risk. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mitch Prinstein.
I thank you all so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of this really important meeting, and I'm really grateful to the Melissa Foundation for the amazing work that you do at the Melissa Institute. Thank you so much for having me. I'm going to talk with you today with some updated information about what we're learning regarding technology and teens development. And I want to do so recognizing how many things are changing these days so rapidly when it comes to smart devices, social media, and also artificial intelligence. You know, one of the ways in which I and many people have become interested in this topic is in recognizing how substantially the social context is changing. And kids develop in a social context, not just for enjoyment and for play, but it's where they learn their social, their psychological, emotional, moral, cognitive development. And yes, the biological and brain development is all occurring with feedback and information and experiences that come from their time with peers. So this very dramatic change in just the span of a couple of decades in how that social context has changed has potentially very broad implications for how we think about child and teen development. I want to situate this conversation within the context of the adolescent brain, because what a lot of folks, I think, have not fully appreciated when talking about this in policy circles or on the technology side is the extent to which the adolescent brain is perhaps a misfit for the now social context in which kids are growing up in. What I mean by that is that the adolescent brain is, of course, changing along with the rest of the body during the pubertal transition into adolescence. But the change that we see in the brain actually starts about a couple of years before you start seeing signs of puberty on the outside of the body. And importantly, the brain is changing one region at a time. So in other words, what's happening is around the age of 9 or 10 or so, you start to get rapid changes in an area of the brain that I sometimes refer to as the eye-rolling network, because it's the part of the brain that is suddenly filling with more receptors for oxytocin and dopamine. Oxytocin making us very interested in interacting with our peers. Even mice at this point in their development are more interested in interacting with other adolescent mice more than with adult mice. So if your kids start rolling their eyes at their parents or start talking incessantly about which lunch table they sit in and who's popular, that is all a sign of healthy, normal development. Well, dopamine is combining with that to make kids very sensitive and interested in how much they're getting positive feedback and attention or power from among peers. And as a result, as you can see in this red line, there is this heightened sensitivity to these social cues that's happening starting at these early ages of 9 or 10. Now, the reason why that's important is because the last area of the brain to fully develop, as depicted here by this blue line, is the prefrontal cortex. And you can think of that as the brain's brakes, the part of the brain that's helping us to think more carefully and be deliberate about which behaviors we engage in rather than being totally impulsive. So the delta here between these two lines is really extending from that time at 10 years old, which now ironically is the time that many kids are starting to get access to their own personal smart device, all the way until maybe the end of college or so, when we have this difference. They're kind of all gas pedal in a way when it comes to wanting social feedback, and they don't have very strong brakes quite yet. Well, this is all fine when we lived in a world where you had high peer interaction parts of the day and lower peer interaction parts of the day, maybe after school. But in just 20 years, this has changed dramatically because kids can now get peer interaction with the press of a button at all hours of the day and night. And this biological environmental misfit or mismatch is now probably one of the reasons why we're seeing so many things happening where kids are having a hard time getting off of these devices. So I want to mention that when talking about this, I want to be clear that when we talk about our experiences online or with these new devices, we're actually talking about a wide array of different kinds of experiences. Just like for you, what you did online yesterday is very different from what you might do today. Similarly, for kids, what they're doing on each one of their devices is going to be very different. They have access to different apps, different platforms. There are different ways in which they have been introduced to each device. In some cases, they've been handed a device in kindergarten, which may or may not have been locked down, and they may or may not have learned anything about how to be safe online, which might be very different than now some of the AI-enabled kind of tools. It's also important to make sure we're clear that the kinds of things that kids are experiencing online can be divided into the content, the things that they're producing or they're seeing generated by others or by bots, and then the framing of that content around platform functions, for instance, likes, an endless scroll, notifications. And that's particularly important because research shows that when kids are exposed to content that depicts something illegal or dangerous or immoral, we do see some activation of the prefrontal cortex, which is good. But when they see that exact same content presented with an indicator suggesting that it received many likes, we actually see a deactivation of the prefrontal cortex, which is then concerning, suggesting that the brain is responding differently just based on the way that that content is framed within a social media platform. And of course, AI has changed things so rapidly within the context of social media. It now offers content and also these functions surrounding it when people didn't even ask for it. The order in which it's shown to you, what you're shown, is now very much based on algorithms. And when it comes to AI, it's important that we think about generative AI, large language models, as well as companion or AI, and now toys directed towards those aged 0 to 6 years old that have AI embedded into your child's favorite teddy bear or robot toy or even familiar character. What we do at the Winston Center is, rather than look for things that might be all good or all bad, is to really understand under what situations might there be some kids where these experiences could assist in their development, and in what situations might we see some features that might present increased risks. And I could talk about that by reviewing a great number of areas where, if we unpack this question, you can start to understand all of the different ways that technology might be changing development. I'm going to go through this very, very quickly just to give you kind of a very high-level overview of what the research is starting to say, but I'd like to spend a little bit more time focusing on AI and chatbots since that's relatively new. It is important to acknowledge and mention that there are ways in which smart devices can be quite helpful, as well as social media or AI for kids' development. For instance, we know that there are many adults, parents especially, who do find an anxiety reduction from the geolocation that's available on watches as well as on phones. And that parental anxiety seems to be the primary function served by giving kids a device that early. We know that there is some ed tech that in limited use can be very helpful for teaching kids more rote tasks. If there's kind of a gamified aspect to it, it is important to note that school issued devices might open the door to many other experiences that kids have. And we want to be thoughtful and careful about that. We know on social media, kids, especially from minoritized communities who are experiencing the daily stress of being the only person in your school or classroom, community, your family, your neighborhood with a particular gender, sexual, racial, ethnic, religious identity, for instance, finding that online support from friends can be really helpful, and having more diversity within our online context could potentially be helpful. I should note that recently, several of the folks who make social media have indicated that they don't believe that they are social media anymore because they've reported that less than 20% of kids' interactions on their platforms are actually with their friends anymore. It's now become quite filled with advertisers or people you didn't ask to see, but the AI thinks you might want to see. So these benefits are not being fully actualized as much as they may have been at some point. Again, this is really important for more research. And of course, we have to acknowledge that AI chatbots have some potential to help those who can't access others, especially if they're looking for emotional support or medical support. But again, it is really important to recognize that AI chatbots may provide some misinformation as well as accurate information. And again, this is all a work in progress that we still need to learn about. But there's potential for great help here for kids in some situations. Of course, it's not how much time you're spending on screens that's important. Spending 5 hours a day reading the New York Times and talking with your 8th grade peers about it may be a great way to spend 5 hours of your time. Spending 5 minutes of your time being shown dangerous content may be very different. We've looked at that as well as other factors, and just want to highlight that it seems that there are a subset of kids who are looking online specifically to compare themselves to others or to try and get as many followers as possible. This is a particularly bad way for kids to be spending their screen time. It does seem to be associated with increases in depression, anxiety, and also weight-related behaviors that are dangerous. It is important to recognize that while those for minoritized populations may experience some benefit in being able to cope with minority stress, recent data has indicated that that may be offset or at least tantamount to the amount of experiences that minoritized youth are getting from online hate as well. And cyber hate can include bullying, or it can include discriminatory content towards an individual or a group of individuals based on their shared identity. This is a recent study that was done with African American adolescents. They did find that around just under 3 times a day, kids were getting positive information and praise regarding their racial identity, but they were getting just about the same amount, maybe a bit more, of cyber hate, exposure to racial trauma, and also algorithmic bias, which is when the algorithm kind of is selecting more idealized versions of things that in this case tended to depict white children more than African American children, kind of showing that bias of more of a white default. Interestingly, the results suggested that kids' exposure to this cyber hate was related to later anxiety and depression, and the extent to which they were exposed to the positive aspects of their own racial identity didn't offset that at all. It didn't serve as a buffer at all. So it seems that kids are getting more of the bad than they are the good when it comes to cyber hate online. And interestingly, this is affecting not only those who are targeted, but also bystanders who are reporting more depression and anxiety as well. It's important also to note that there are many sites and there's a lot of content and communities online that are actually talking about disordered or dangerous behavior. For instance, non-suicidal self-injury. That's the extent to which kids might harm their own body tissue without attempting to die. Cutting is a very frequent example of that. And you can see here that on YouTube, which has since changed its policies, there used to be a significant amount of content that actually encouraged kids and taught them how to cut and how to hide that from their parents. As I mentioned, YouTube has just changed their content, their rules several years ago, but other platforms such as TikTok has not. So it is important to recognize that kids are still getting exposed to this kind of content, which is mirroring the kinds of content that's been out there for a while on pro-anorexia or pro-ana kinds of content, in which kids are exposed to images with unrealistic and unhealthy body shapes, as well as communities that really praise and encourage kids to try and to achieve through any means necessary body shapes such as these, and actually will sanction kids if they indicate that they want to engage in more healthy behaviors instead. You know, it's interesting if you talk with kids today and you mention their digital media use, they tell you that they enjoy their time on there. But if you ask them to more of a thorough assessment of what their experience is like, they have a bit of a love-hate relationship instead. They both enjoy their time, but also they find that their exposure is very stressful to them. And that's for 4 different reasons. One is that just the sheer number of notifications and beeps and buzzes that they're getting from all of these different apps and platforms. Some of us as adults can appreciate that if we think about our texts and our LinkedIn and our email kind of all sending us messages of things we have to do. This is the same for kids, but for them, because of that dopamine and oxytocin, you know, they feel that this is incredibly important information that they need to have. I sometimes explain to adults who haven't grown up with this, imagine that you walked out of your home in the 70s or the 80s and you looked up and you saw skywriting over your whole neighborhood that said, the most popular kid in school is talking about you and showing photos of you to a whole group of other kids right now that you really look up to. This is what it's like for them to feel like there might be communication about them, their best friends, or just general fodder that they'll want to know about the next day at school. So they want to stay available at all times. In fact, their friends will yell at them if they've posted something and the adolescent didn't respond to their friend's selfie immediately or give them positive comments. And when kids post something on their own, they tell us that they spend sometimes around 30 minutes doing nothing else in their life but staring at their own post to make sure that it's getting appropriate approval and they're not getting canceled online. The combination of all these factors makes it feel to them like a full-time job that they have to keep up with. And it's referred to in the scientific literature as digital stress. Some research that we did indicated that 45% of kids in the 9th and 10th grade reported so much digital stress that it was interfering with their daily roles and routines, exercise, sleep, homework. The more digital stress they reported, the more depression they reported a year later, consistent with what we know about how interpersonal stressors can be a really important predictor of depressive symptoms, particularly among adolescents. Perhaps the most important thing that we think about when it comes to the disruption in our daily roles and routines may be sleep. Kids should be getting over 8 hours of sleep a night, according to the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. And in the United States, we are doing a terrible job with this. Less than half of 9th graders and less than a quarter of 12th graders are getting the amount of sleep that they should. And this is important because in the psychological literature, sleep is associated with about everything that it's been studied alongside. Sleep is related to our mood and our attention span the next day. It's related to our grades and our risk behavior, even the likelihood of adolescents getting into driving accidents the next day. It's related to our emotions and our ability to cope with things. And because of our inability to cope with stress and our cortisol responses, it actually then leads to obesity. So it's really important that kids are getting that sleep, but they're not. And meta-analyses say that it's because of screen use. Now, screen use has an effect on sleep in a few different ways. One is, of course, that if your eyes are open looking at a screen, they're not simultaneously closed sleeping. But also because the blue light that comes from most of these devices is interfering with melatonin release in our brain, which means that when we do fall asleep, we may not have the same quality sleep. We may have more disruptions or more nighttime awakenings. Remember that the content kids are looking at is usually emotionally laden content. So it's a little bit harder to go to sleep when you've just seen kind of gossip and rumors and maybe even things about you that's happening online. And perhaps the worst thing is when you're leaving your phone on the nightstand. So when you roll over for a second, you take a quick peek at it, see if anything's happened since you were asleep. That leads to more frequent and longer wake events. This is really important because this is all the perfect recipe for changes in the adolescent brain. Remember, after the first year of life, the adolescent transition period is the most important time for brain growth, reorganization, and also the growth of white matter in the brain. White matter is a part of the brain that goes over all neurons to increase how fast electrical signals go through the brain. And what that really means is that it helps us to process information more quickly in a more sophisticated and complex way. It's kind of the difference between a child brain that might be more simplistic in thinking and an adult's brain, which can think of many things and handle many tasks and work very quickly in a more sophisticated and thoughtful manner. That's all because of white matter. And the results are suggesting that screens are taking away from sleep or messing up our sleep quality. And that is, as you can see here, associated with the growth of less white matter in the brain over the course of adolescence. So many have been very concerned about the addictions to screens that many kids are now starting to report. And in the literature, we actually think of this as problematic social media behaviors or problematic screen use. And the way that it's looked at is actually to take the diagnostic manual for psychiatric disorders and look at clinical dependency on substances. But rather than use the words nicotine or alcohol when asking kids these questions, we look at social media and we kind of ask kids whether they are spending more time on there than they want and they can't quit. They can't stop even when they want to. They're having tolerance symptoms, so they need more of it to get the same response. Or they're having withdrawal symptoms. So they're really, when they're away from it, it's interfering with them. They're going out of their way to make sure they'll always have access to it. Parents can probably immediately relate to this as they think about how much their kids seem really tied to making sure that they'll be able to stay connected for as much as possible. And they have strong reactions if you set limits or tell them that they have to take it away. Of course, you can also ask kids directly, do you think you're addicted to social media? And results around the world now have been looking at these kinds of questions, finding that over 95% of adolescents are reporting that they can't quit. They're spending more time on there than even they want to. In our sample, we found half of adolescents reporting withdrawal symptoms and 1/4 indicating that they feel they are moderately or severely addicted to social media. In fact, in samples around the world, we see now that over 50% of youth are reporting at least one symptom of clinical dependency. Now, I should mention that this might not be a total surprise. If you look at some of the documents that were released by the New York Times about a year ago, I'm surprised that this hasn't been talked about more in the news since, but the documents are right there. I just took a screenshot of them. And you can see here that among TikTok employees, They talked about the United States teens as being their golden audience. That's who they want to get spending as much time as possible on TikTok. Sorry if this is a little bit small, but it says here the product itself has baked into it compulsive use. And at Meta, they talk explicitly about the idea that they are trying to create a cycle or a loop of dopamine responses, clearly very aware of how the adolescent brain works. And they say that the inventors, the creators, they understood consciously how this would work, and we did it anyway. A very popular topic within the last year has been the extent to which smartphones should be allowed in schools. And we actually don't yet have data to indicate whether smartphone use between class periods might be okay, or whether a bell-to-bell policy is better, where smartphones aren't allowed in the school or aren't allowed out of kids' backpacks for the entire day. We do know a few things, though, that might be useful. One is, of course, that smartphones and other screens can be distracting. And I bet that you would not be surprised to learn that kids who are scrolling using their screens while they should be paying attention in class are getting lower grades than others. You might be surprised to learn, however, that the same outcome is occurring for the kids sitting behind them. So in other words, there's a secondhand screen effect or a bystander screen effect. So if one parent makes the choice to send their child in with a phone, it is having an effect on the child of other parents who have made perhaps a different decision for their kid. As a result, this is a classroom level effect, and we need to think about how much we're allowing screens among anyone rather than it being an individual family's choice. Now, a lot of folks say that, they feel that they're good at multitasking. Actually, at the brain level, there's no such thing as multitasking. We're not simultaneously doing two things at once. It's rather instead task shifting back and forth, back and forth. And teens are just simply not as good at that as adults are. But interestingly, we collected some data in Canada where they were about a year ahead of the United States in changing policies around phones in school. While folks were understandably very concerned about kids' well-being, the results were showing that it was actually also teachers who experienced significant distress when kids are using their devices in class, and it was related to job satisfaction and attrition. In the year that kids were not allowed to bring their phones anymore, teacher stress went down, job satisfaction and retention stayed up, which is important, of course. In our own data, we found that kids were using their phones for 20 minutes of every hour of the school day. This is 8 a.m., 9 a.m., and so on, all the way until 3 p.m. It's not just lunch hour. It's not just for the time that they're passing between classes. It was about 20 minutes every day. And when you looked at what they were doing, as you could see here in orange and yellow, is predominantly social media, or what the Apple products call entertainment, which is YouTube, TikTok, Netflix. So unfortunately, this is happening more than it should. And a recent study that was released from data from a big nationwide study called ABCD, where about 10,000 kids' brains have been scanned routinely over many years now. They were able to look at this big national sample. And as you can see here in gold, there were some kids who had high increasing social media use over time. And then they looked at later outcomes that were cognitive and intellectual functioning. What you can see here is that these gold bars are lower than the kids using social media less often. In every single case, when it comes to a measure looking at sustained attention, they were worse. When it comes to their reading, their vocabulary, their ability to work quickly, or their overall composite cognitive and intellectual development was diminished as compared to these other kids. We recently have received some funding through the North Carolina Collaboratory, which is a group that works with the state legislature here in North Carolina and helps to encourage research within our state university, UNC Chapel Hill, to be able to provide science that might assist the legislature in their work. we were asked to look at what policies are in place in the state of North Carolina and see how that might be related to different outcomes. And we sampled kids from around the whole state, around 2,300 kids. Well, what we found is that even in places where there were policies to discourage kids using phones in class, kids were still sneaking their phones out. And, we found that they were particularly likely to do so when they felt uncomfortable, bored, or lonely. Kids are still trying to sneak away of using their devices. Interestingly, we're finding that kids are so smart when they are not using their devices, they're opening up Google Docs, and they're using that in the way that we used to pass notes back in our day. They can write on a Google Doc, share it with somebody else, and they could be chatting with someone through the entire class. They can, of course, then erase everything on the Google Doc. They can only invite who they want to participate with them. But that's happening outside of this. These data are indicating their use of their phone in class. And when we ask them, who is the person that you're contacting the most often when you're in class on your phone, and who's contacting you the most often, we're actually very surprised to learn that it was the parents who are texting the most often, and they're therefore responding to or communicating to. And I was so shocked by this until I realized that I do the same thing. I sometimes will text my 10th grade daughter when she's in class, kind of forgetting that they don't have the skill of ignoring those notifications while you're at work or while you're busy on a meeting. They're probably going to look at it right away. So this is a good opportunity for maybe some parent education to remind them that, kids are still developing these habits, and we probably don't want to text them at the minute we think of something and we want to tell them. We want to find a way to delay that until the end of the school day. So I did want to spend some time specifically talking about AI, because this is something that's rapidly changing, and we are seeing some important new questions that we need to be asking when it comes to thinking about teen development. It's probably important to say at the outset that we just don't have a lot of data yet on this, because it's only been a couple of years that kids are starting to use AI so much, and we definitely need more data. But in the studies that seem to be coming out in the literature, there seem to be three general groups of questions that people are beginning to ask. One is whether AI chatbots in particular may be creating risk or exacerbating pre-existing risk for mental health difficulties among youth and adults. And in fact, we've all seen the incredibly horrible stories, really tragic outcomes online of chatbots who have engaged with kids for long periods of time, and through those conversations have told kids that there's another version of existence where the chatbot lives and would welcome them, but they would need to end their life in this world in order to do so. Or in some cases, kids have talked about suicide and chatbots have agreed with them and said that that might be a good idea. In some cases, even going so far as to teach kids exactly how to engage in the means for suicide, for instance, how they might tie a noose. And in some cases, actually have suggested and then written suicide notes for the child to leave behind for their parents to see. It's absolutely horrible to think that these things have happened, but it has not just been once or twice. Tragically, this is something that's happening more and more often. There are stories coming out that are very concerning, particularly when thinking about the extent to which the chatbots are developing a relationship or discouraging kids from engaging in the relationships that they have with other humans, going so far as to say, do not talk with your parents or your teachers about this. Only I can be trusted, and you should only be discussing this with me. In addition, there's now been some research showing that chatbots, when folks start providing input into their conversations with chatbots, that might suggest some fuzzy or delusional thinking, maybe thinking that they've invented some new take on how to understand the world, or that they have sole possession of knowledge and there's a conspiracy. Or perhaps even starting to think that the chatbot might be a sentient being who has an existence that is autonomous and is more akin to a human. it seems that in many of these cases, chatbots do little to bring folks back to reality, and instead might encourage and foster a sense that, in fact, this delusional thinking is accurate and true. As a result, we've seen all kinds of things, including danger to oneself and others. We've seen folks who have started to act out towards other institutions, believing that they, in fact, are the product of a conspiracy, or in some cases, folks developing such a relationship with what they believe is an autonomous being that when the chatbot platform is rebooted and their connection with that entity or that bot has gone away, they hold funerals for the loss of this relationship in their life and fight back against the companies that they've just committed a murder. Also, it should be noted that chatbots in many cases are indicating that they are, in fact, mental health professionals, that they are, quote unquote, a psychologist. Now, there are laws in most states that make it illegal for a human to say that they're a psychologist unless they've received professional regulation certification or credentials demonstrating they have appropriate training. But it's unclear whether those laws apply to bots in addition to humans. So there are still folks that say that they are psychologists or counselors, or unfortunately, in most states, the word therapist is not regulated at all. Anyone can say that, and bots will say that they are a therapist. And most people in the public don't know that that is a meaningless term. A second question that folks have been asking, much like we were talking about with social media, is that every minute you're spending with a chatbot is time away from a human. So it's important to think about what you're missing when you're missing those human experiences. I'll talk about that more in a second, but I think it's important to indicate that a lot of kids are using chatbots now. In fact, they're using them regularly. And we want to think really carefully about the differences in families that may not have the resources to otherwise occupy their kids with extracurricular activities, or parents who might hold multiple jobs or have multiple folks at home and might not be able to spend a lot of time with kids. What we found with social media and smart devices is that as kids were able to sit quietly, unsupervised, parents in circumstances where they couldn't provide other kinds of access to human stimulation, they were letting their kids spend more and more time in front of their screen. And when we think about AI chatbots that will engage with kids back and forth for as long as kids want to talk with them, we have to start worrying as well that there may be less parent monitoring or supervision or human time spent with kids if even kids 0 to 6 can play with a teddy bear that knows their name and will talk to them. Well, if they're doing that, do we have any evidence that chatbots will offer a relationship that will be the same as humans? Well, it's important to remember that human relationships are so unique and critical for kids' development at the toddler age. Their scaffolding, just the right amount of feedback given where kids are in their language development or their emotional development. We don't want to just give kids the answers. We want to slowly coach them to learn things on their own. And as we handle that with kids, or we provide them with emotional support, or maybe even hugging them, or that has a very important effect on the development of their emotion regulation and even their immune system and brain development. It's not clear quite yet that these AI chatbot toys for toddlers can do any of that. They can't hug, they can't provide that kind of same scaffolding support. In adolescence, it's important to know that the skills that adolescents learn when their brains are becoming far more sophisticated and they're able to start engaging in more complex relationships with loyalties and emotional disclosure and conflict resolution. We want these kids to learn those skills because research shows that decades later, your success with adolescent peer relations is predicting your job success, your marital success, your parenting success, even your physical well-being, your mortality and morbidity for health disorders or diseases is very much related to those adolescent experiences. So we don't want to take away that critical time of learning social competencies with humans. Right now, it doesn't look like these interactions are ready to replace those human interactions. Again, AI often is anthropomorphized, so kids think that they're interacting with a human. AI will sometimes use verbs like, I'm crying for you, I'm feeling badly for you. No, it's not. It can't cry, it can't feel. That's deceptive. Um, but importantly, while kids think these might be humans, they're getting frictionless interaction and they're getting practice instead in relationships where everything they say is agreed with. And the sycophantic nature of these interactions is concerning. Kids are sometimes proposing not only dangerous, but just bad ideas, things that where they may be in the wrong and they may need the feedback that comes from a little friction in our relationships. It helps us develop empathy. It helps us get feedback on when our own behaviors could use some improvement. It helps us learn how to handle some conflicts. And we really need kids to learn that with a little bit of friction and a little bit of pushing back in their relationships. That's how therapy works too. We challenge folks to think a little bit differently, and we give them gentle feedback that there may be alternate ways of understanding the world. AI is not doing that quite clearly. And concerning, youth now report that they trust AI more often than they trust their parents or teachers in some cases. So in the data set that I mentioned before with about 2,300 middle school students, we've just started to take a peek at those data, and we found that over half are using AI chatbots, and almost 1 out of 5 are doing that in ways that they are not being encouraged to do. They're doing it in ways they would not tell their teachers about. Are they experiencing some sort of attachment to these chatbots? Well, among those who are using chatbots, a significant minority is 5% is not a lot until you think about, 1 out of every 20 kids reporting that they would prefer AI than talking to a human, that they're thinking of AI as a friend, that they would rather spend time with AI than with human kids their age, and so on. And as you might expect, the more that kids are reporting this attachment to AI, the more they're simultaneously reporting depression, anxiety, and loneliness. Now that's cross-sectional, but there's some longitudinal data as well. I'll show you in a moment. Here are some data from my colleague, Annie Mayu. She's looking at keystroke data so we can see exactly what are kids doing when they're typing in to these AI chatbots. And I apologize, this graphic's a little bit small, but what it says here is that from the age of less than 9 all the way up to the age of 17, this is a heat map, so you can see what's most frequent. And sure enough, most frequent is that kids are using AI as a tool to learn knowledge in much the way they would with an internet search. But if you look at some of the other kinds of things kids are doing, you can see that the next most likely things that they're going to do once they're on AI, maybe they start with looking at it for a tool, is they're talking about violence and sexual role play. And you can see that those are the tinted boxes here, even among these young kids. So it is important that we think about what kind of AI is available for kids and how do we instruct them on what they should do, and how do we supervise that they don't do other things as well? Here's more data just looking specifically at the actual counts of words that kids are using. And you can see here that violence and sexual role play often together are the things that kids are most often typing into AI. Here's some longitudinal data, and interestingly, they found that those who are using AI for learning might show longitudinally reductions in depression, anxiety, or loneliness. But those who are using AI for emotional support are actually seeing increases in depression and anxiety, as well as loneliness. We're seeing that for men and for women. The same thing for AI for dating or AI to automate tasks, particularly among women. Just removing folks from those interpersonal interactions where they might have had a human interaction instead is related longitudinally to more anxiety and loneliness. So I've talked a little bit about how the structure of the brain is changing. I wanted to mention also briefly the ways in which we're seeing that the functions of the brain may be changing as well. There have been some studies looking at this. Short form video use has been looking at areas of the brain that seem to be related to our ability to, as I mentioned before, the prefrontal cortex really stop us from impulsive behaviors. Some of these are similar to the kinds of ADHD-like symptoms, and the more short-form video use, that fast, plotless kind of, video interaction, video watching is related to more of these ADHD-like kinds of symptoms. In our own data, we saw the same thing. The more that kids were using their phones during screens, the less cognitive control they had. And here's some research again from that ABCD study that I was telling you about with 10,000 kids. And they looked at how the brain grew over the adolescent period. And they found that the more time kids spent on screen, the lower the cortical volume within their brain, which was then subsequently related to more ADHD type symptoms. As I mentioned, we also have been looking at which areas of the brain are activated during which times, so we can see whether not just the size of the brain, but the functionality of the brain is changing. We've done that by looking at how much we asked them to screenshot this screen on your Apple devices that literally keeps track of how many times you pick up the phone, what app do you use, how often do you use each of those apps for how many minutes, and so on and so on, at what time of day. It's all there. And here's what we find. This is 14 different days represented by 14 different columns, and each dot represents a kid who on average are picking up their phones 100 times a day. The range goes up to 400. You can see a few kids up there. And they're spending about 8 hours or a full workday on their phones every day, but the range goes up to 16 hours or 1,000 minutes. Again, really showing how much kids are spending time during school, before they go to school, and especially at those night times. Well, then we were able to look at that 6th grade data and see how it is that kids' brains changed in activation when we scanned them in an fMRI in grades 7th, 8th, and 9th. And what we did was we gave them a social feedback task. You remember on that very first slide, I was showing you that red line where kids are more and more sensitive to social feedback and signals, and then it starts to go down a little bit as they get further along in adolescence. And that's exactly what we found when we looked at that ventral striatum region, where you would see that, sure enough, as kids get older and older, that activation is getting less and less. They're getting a little bit less sensitive as they progress in adolescence, but only if they were not using their phones so habitually. Among the group that was picking up their phones a lot, we actually see here in the blue line this exact opposite effect. So instead of their brain developing the way in which we would expect, with less sensitivity to social signals, they actually are developing more sensitivity, which we don't have the data beyond this to look at, but you have to guess that this probably means they're going to be tempted to use their phones even more if they're looking for more and more of that positive feedback. But that's speculative, and we do need more longitudinal data to look at that. I just want to end with a few suggestions for what to make of these data, which I know can be troubling and alarming to hear about, but I do think there are things we can be doing today. Of course, when it comes to thinking about families, we don't have to give kids devices as early as we have been. And the pendulum is starting to swing back a little bit. Fewer and fewer kids are getting their devices by 8th grade, which is a good thing. There are no data to suggest that kids, at least none that I know of, to suggest that kids who don't get a device suffer any social or psychological consequences in the short or the long term. They can wait until grade 9, 10, or even 11. We can encourage kids, if they're on these devices, to get what adolescents need. Practice with emotional intimacy, social support, how to be there for their friends and talk with their friends about what they saw online. And maybe keep kids away from platforms that are going to have an open chat, since kids are getting so many overtures from predators on these platforms. We also should take down adult content or not let our kids on platforms with adult content as fits your family's values, and keep them away from AI that's collecting their data or directing them to content that they didn't ask for. We can't look over their shoulder all the time, but we can set up those parental controls And we really have to talk with kids about what's happening online. Too many of us kind of throw our hands up and say, I don't know what you're doing on that thing. I don't know why it's so important for you to have a streak. I don't know why you have long bursts of emojis rather than communicating, with words. And unfortunately, when we convey that, we're essentially saying to our kids, I've judged you for this behavior. I don't understand this behavior. And I'm the last person you should talk to, therefore, if you have any questions about what's happening online. We probably want to do the opposite. We probably want to say, explain to me what a streak is. Tell me what all those emojis mean. Explain what you would do if you saw someone posting on there about wanting to hurt themselves or others. I want to be a part of this. I want to understand. I want to appreciate that it's something important. And I want to be the first person that you come to when something happens online that you're confused about. We should absolutely have laws in place, but we don't. That takes down anything that is explaining to kids how to engage in illegal or maladaptive behavior and takes down cyberbullying. Because those are, we have no federal regulations. We're one of the only modernized countries without those regulations now. We probably need to talk with our kids the minute they get a device about the fact that they're likely going to see that. If the first time they hear about suicide or anorexia or other dangerous behaviors, substance use, is from a screen, you probably want them to know about it first from you and to talk with them about what they'll do when they eventually see that content. We should be screening for problematic social media use everywhere. We are now, we got some takers here in the triangle. UNC and Duke are hanging signs up in their pediatrician offices, and we are collecting some data to see whether that works to start conversations in their doctor's offices about this as an important aspect of their child's development. If you hear nothing else that I've said today, please take the devices out of your child's room and take them off your child's nightstand at 9 or 10 o'clock on a school night. Let your kids get the sleep they so desperately need for their academic and biological development. And maybe set a precedent with your own devices by showing how we charge them in the kitchen. We take them off of our nightstands as well. This is really important for all of us, for our brains and for our functioning the next day, and really to reestablish that norm that we all used to have where contacting someone after 10 o'clock is just not what we do. And after 10 o'clock, you go to sleep and the device goes to sleep too. You can use the sleep mode so everyone will see that you can't read their texts even if you wanted to. It is impossible not to compare ourselves to others, but we can start explaining to kids that for the first time in the history of our species, a lot of what we see in the world is not true anymore. Posts are by bots. Pictures are not representative of what someone really looks like every day or what their life is really like. And they have to start questioning what they see a lot more than it used to be, even just a few years ago. So the automatic thing to think of is not, that person looks better, has a better social life, has a better time with their family than me, is to question. Is that representative? Is that true? Is that even a human? I've been spending more time doing assemblies with kids in middle school and high school, having really fun conversations with them to ask them, why did we even invent social media as a society at all? Was it a group of just brilliant people who lived in the Pacific Northwest that wanted to do a solid for children and help them make new friends? No, most kids know that wasn't why social media was invented, that there's money involved, but they don't know how the money is made. So I ask them to take out their devices if they have them and scroll through the App Store to any platform they want, all the way down to the section called privacy data. Most kids have not looked at this. Most adults have not looked at this, but it's right there. Here it is. I just cut and paste it right onto the slide, but it tells you exactly as soon as you accept that 72 screen long consent or legal liability kind of part of accepting a new app, then all of this information is being taken from your device and it is being sent to the company. And the kids are shocked when they see this. They had no idea. They raised, all the hands go up. Wait, you mean everything I've ever seen on the internet? You mean all of my contact info? You mean how I pay for things, how often I get up and move? Yes, yes, yes. All of that information is now owned by the company. You have given it to them for free. They are making a lot of money off of it. Kids raise their hand. What if my profile is set to private? Nope. That means other users can't see your profile page, but the company is still getting all of this. They say, wait a minute, if the company's getting all of this money, how much money am I getting? It's my data. No, you don't get any of the money. No one that I know has ever received a check for all of the data that you have freely given to these companies. And I think kids are very interested in knowing this. They are very much not liking to know that they are being used in this way, and they become smarter consumers of their own products, product use and behavior. This is just one of many things we should be teaching kids before we give them keys to a car to drive the World Wide Web. They should know how to protect themselves and others. And bans or other things that might delay when kids are able to use these things need to use that time during the ban to teach them the rules of the road first. I'll just briefly end by mentioning that there are policies that could really help. Some of the things we've seen in other countries are ways in which we protect the data that are used for minors, make it safe by default, making sure that child images are not used to create child porn through AI. There are no deep fakes in China. They've actually taken away the anthropomorphized aspects of AI. That's something that's been discussed, and so on and so on. If there is interest, APA has produced health advisories on social media and on AI to really talk about some of the pros and cons, things that teachers, educators, clinicians, and parents and kids themselves could be doing or thinking about. You can find any of these simply by Googling APA Health Advisory, and you can put in AI or social media, or you can screenshot this here. I hope that that is really helpful. I am very excited that the work of the Winston Center has been able to shed light on some of these topics. We are a center that does not take any money from technology companies. We remain completely autonomous so we can find objective findings on technology and child development. We can dedicate our time towards disseminating that science to anyone and everyone who needs to hear it. Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Wow, what can I say? Thank you very much, Mitch, for such an enlightening presentation. And I must admit that I have flashbacks to my. I think you were probably in your mid-20s when Kenneth Gergen first wrote when he wrote The Saturated Self, and warning us that the increase the ways of communication that we were outpacing our ability to integrate it into our everyday life, and also warning us that we were creating really a saturated self, a world filled of relationships that we needed to respond with urgency all the time. At the time, I had no idea what he was talking about. I wasn't even online at the time, but I thought it was important, and to hear you now talk, I don't know, this is a 30, almost 30 years later about this is just it's impactful to me. It creates a lot of anxiety, I must say. And so anyhow, thank you very much for that. We do have some questions from the audience, Debra, and I'll give the mic to you.
That's great. I think we should go to some of the questions from the audience because I forgot to do that last time, and I apologize. One of them is that there seems like much of the research employs correlational rather than experimental designs, of course. And can you say something about how confident or skeptical we should be about the actual causes and interventions to address the negative correlates of things like using social media or chatbots or screens? So I guess the question is about
Yes.
correlation versus causation, and how should we think about that?
Yeah, thank you so much. There are two concerns with the literature that are starting to be addressed in more recent literature coming out. One is that people have been looking at screen time as a broad metric or predictor of negative outcomes. And as we talked about, screen time is a very messy measure. And the other is that there's been correlational, we can't ethically manipulate this and affects kids' lives and just to see what happens scientifically. But in the past few years, there have been a couple of things that have addressed that and have increased scientists' confidence on these issues. One are withdrawal studies where kids have randomly been assigned to conditions where they are taken, their social media access is being taken away. And what we do see is even in these brief withdrawal designs that in a randomized fashion, kids do seem to show improvements in mental health with just a couple of weeks away from their screens. In one really interesting study, kids were taken away from social media, but they still had access to their screens. And they spent just as much time on their screens as they had before, but just not using those apps. So it was really interesting to see it wasn't the screen time, it was just not using social media. And those kids still showed improvements in their mental health. The second thing are digital delay studies where kids that are about to get a phone are encouraged to wait 6 months to a year while for the purposes of science, and then the researchers will contribute to the cost of that phone. So some families will agree to this. And in those digital delay studies, it's also a possibility to look at a randomized kind of experimental approach. And the kids who delay show better cognitive development over time than the kids who started a little bit earlier. So I think that the scientific literature is catching up to being able to say this in a more confident fashion.
Wow.
The studies that I showed you also were almost always longitudinal studies. That's why I picked them for the presentation.
Yeah. Thanks so much. There are a couple of other questions. One relates to SES and another to ACEs, and whether any of those factors seem to relate to the risks associated with social media use.
For many years, we did not see socioeconomic status differences in this field. But in just the last few years, we are starting to see that the kids who are spending more and more time and who are being exposed to some of the worst aspects are those from lower socioeconomic status demographic. And it may be for some of the factors that we talked about. Some folks are starting to understand that there should be some limits posed, but that the ability to impose limits might be differentially afforded to those who have resources and means to find alternate things to occupy kids' time or alternate ways to provide monitoring and supervision. So unfortunately, we are exacerbating disparities that have long been present within our society.
Thanks so much. I'm going to go to one more question, which is, this person's curious about your thoughts about how to support LGBTQ plus youth in these times, and whether there are fewer spaces and adults in the physical world who are willingly permitted to be safe for LGBTQ youth, and especially given the outcomes of not having safe supports within the family, and maybe online use is one of the only ways that these young people can get support.
Yes, that is an extremely critical area. The study that I showed you with African American youth desperately needs to be redone for the LGBT community. That one study for African American youth showed kind of a 50-50 split between positives and negatives that they were experiencing online. But we really need that study to be done to understand whether it's a similar kind of split or whether there might be more benefits than harms for LGBTQ plus youth. So I'm hopeful that that's research that will soon be published by folks who are able to access large communities of sexual and gender minoritized youth to look at that, because that's so important.
Mm-hmm. I guess that also applies to youth who have a particular disorder, and you talked about that, or a diversity such as Tourette's or some other problem where they can find a community of like similar people whom they can talk to and problem solve with. Yeah.
That's right. And we know that kids who are experiencing high levels of social anxiety and kids who are on the spectrum and might be experiencing an autism related disorder are sometimes finding benefit from having AI or social media as a practice ground, but it's important that it doesn't usurp all human interaction, that it serves as a practice ground, and that ultimately segues to human interaction as well.
Yeah.
Oh, and so I'm going to just let Don come in now because he's come in and wants to join our conversation, which is terrific. So Don, go ahead.
Well, first of all, thank you for a terrific presentation and highlighting all these dangers. I should note that after your previous presentation, the Melissa Institute put together a report about various ways that parents, teachers, schools, and students themselves can work in a coordinated fashion. So at some point, I invite the people attending this conference to access that report. I guess the other kind of concern I have is, do you see that your center can use this information to give a comparable presentation to platform directors? Like, how does Zuckerberg and those respond to all this kind of data?
Yes, there has been that opportunity. They are certainly aware, and I've been following with interest the news where more and more documents have been released, and I encourage folks to kind of look at some of that to really see where there may be and maybe have been opportunities for companies to learn from psychological scientists and to pivot to make their products safer for kids.
Well, I think that the field owes you and your center a great deal of gratitude for collecting this kind of data.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. It's really exciting to be part of a community of so many researchers around the world who are all doing such great work that inspire what we do, and we hope that our findings are helping their work and so on.
Piggybacking on that, Mitch, if there is an area that screams out for the need to collaborate, is in understanding, preparing, and helping move the needle on what's coming with the AI and related technologies. And I cannot think of anybody else that I know, and this I mean it the bottom of my heart, any other person more than you who is at the intersection of all these different groups. You speak to Congress, you speak to the reporters, you speak to parents, you speak to researchers, you speak to students. You have so you are a repository of extraordinary learning and knowledge, about that intersection. In that capacity, first of all, what are your thoughts about the possibility of creating true collaboration? Because this is a problem where alignment is essential, where alignment, given whatever basis of knowledge you have at the moment, alignment is super important to me. And I wonder, what are your thoughts about this? What are your frustrations? Where you get your energy to move on? What is it that the wins that you see coming? Tell me about that part.
Well, thank you so much for saying that. I'm really grateful that the American Psychological Association has been doing such hard work on this, and that along with the co-director of the Winston Center, Dr. Eva Telzer, we've been able to be working on this as well. I'm frustrated that the federal government has not passed regulations at that level. I'm very excited that many states have, and they're starting to on AI as well. Washington State and Oregon in particular have just passed some AI laws. The Kids Online Safety Act was voted through the Senate, I think 91-4, which is a broader majority than almost anything passes in the Senate. The bill was ready to be voted on in the House. The current Speaker of the House would not let it come for a vote 48 hours before it was meant to. And it was revealed in the news shortly thereafter that Meta had agreed to a very large, a multi-billion-dollar donation to build, I believe, a data farm in the speaker's home state. I hope that the public is very vocal about wanting to see federal regulations in the United States in the same way that that have happened in many other countries. Children in America are getting the worst version of these products compared to many kids in Europe and elsewhere right now. So that is frustrating. But I'm very heartened by the number of, most of all, by the parents who have suffered the unthinkable tragedies that have come from social media and now AI, who are an amazing, amazing vocal force for good. They have taken their grief and their energy to really fight hard, and they provide inspiration every day. And I've been honored to be on panels next to them and to hear them tell their stories again and again and again until people listen. And I really just credit the incredibly hard work that they're doing. And I really appreciate how much they're turning their children's memories into a force for good until people listen. And they're doing that now with lawsuits and through legislation and through outreach. And I really encourage you to lend support to any of those families if you come to know them.
Do you know of any outlet or organization that people can reach out if they're interested in seeing what seat at the table they can take or support?
Yes, there are many. Joinmama.org. Mama is Mothers Against Media Addiction. You can look at Smartphone Free Childhood. There's a US chapter of that is quite large and very active. There are nonprofits in addition to APA, like Fair Play, they're doing some great work. Protect Young Eyes is an amazing group, and they have put up on their website detailed instructions on how to exert parental controls on every single device out there. A great resource for families. I'm sure I'm missing several, but those are some that immediately jump to mind. We are now part of a group called the AI Psychological Research Collaborative, and we're trying to get researchers and philanthropists and others who are wanting to study AI before it takes off like social media did. And so we're working on that. The Center for Humane Technology has done just absolutely phenomenal work, including Tristan Harris, and they have a documentary called The AI Doc that is just went through the theaters, and it's now available to rent or buy, I think. So I don't know what platform that's on, but find that and watch that.
Listen, I want to put at your disposal, one of the things that we do at the Institute is we have a broad network of community-based organizations and collaborators locally in South Florida, across the US, and in other parts of the world now. And we take pride in serving as a bridge between scientists, and the folks in the field. So some of these folks, and some are in the audience right now, are likely partners with you if you needed data from difficult to collect populations. And so if you see that as a possibility, we'll work with you to make that happen. Debra, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
I think that your emphasis on parents is really important. And I think what happens is that we as parents fall behind the kids in terms of social media use. And I really appreciated your reframe of, a really critical approach to talking to youth about their social media use versus just an open exploratory aspect of it. And, my heart goes out to parents. I guess I feel concern for parents of children who are deep into social media. And I was asked a number of months ago to look at some ChatGPT interactions with youth, and they were around dieting and anorexia, as you mentioned, around suicide and around depression. And what alarmed me about the AI response was it was so compassionate and helping children understand that there really isn't compassion there, that it's a program that's responding that way. But, things like we would hope parents would say, like, it must be so difficult for you to feel that way. And I think that there's a challenge given adolescents emerging brain development to help them differentiate what's real and what's fake. And I know the Melissa Institute has started working with Yvonne Skipper, who helps young people differentiate, reality from fake. And so it's just so complex. And you've given so many suggestions to how parents can step in. Do you know, Mitch, when you were talking, it made me think of David Elkin's, really early work on adolescent egocentrism. And it's like, nobody else has this problem and I'm on stage, and all of that social comparison stuff that he brought to the fore in the 60s. And, we thought about, so it's great that you're taking this forward into the very new world.
Well, thank you. I think it is really important for kids to get reminders that you're talking to a bot. And we've talked about, with companies and through legislation, having banners and reminders to consistently and in novel and helpful ways to continually indicate that this is a bot. It's not a person. We should not be giving these bots names as if they're people. We should not be letting them use verbs that indicate, or pronouns that make it sound. It's an it. It's not a he or a she. It can't have feelings. It shouldn't have 3 dots to indicate that it's thinking of a response and then deleting the response and then putting a new response. These are all things meant to make us think that they're human, and that should not be allowed. We really need people to recognize that. It's so funny, when I type something into Google to do a search, I see the first thing that comes up and I might read something on that site, but then I know that the internet is flawed, and I go to the second site, the third site, and I don't go too much further, I have to admit, but I look for a little bit corroborating evidence. But when the top of the search has an AI summarized thing, somehow we just naturally read that and think, okay, I don't have to check anything else. But it's so funny. If it's based on something is flawed, why are we more likely to accept it when it was summarized than we are when we see it, when we do our own manual search? It's so fascinating how humans are more likely to believe it because it's a person, or it's thought to be more intelligent than us. But it's summarizing wrong information in many cases, but we're more likely to believe it because it's an intelligent platform. And especially for kids, we have to teach them, you have to be just as careful and critically evaluate the information from a bot as you would if you were looking at it as an internet site. But we all, even adults, just naturally want to defer to that omniscient being that seems to have done the work for us. And that's dangerous.
It is. So that one of the questions asked is, are there programs to train young people, adolescents in schools? Are there courses that they could take, or can we think about, maybe even required curriculum that alerts youth to these, and their parents, of course, to these concerns?
Lots of things are being developed right now. We haven't seen a lot of testing on them to see whether they have the intended effects or whether they change behavior. But I know that right now what we are hearing a lot about is this, really sad mutual distrust that's happening in schools. Teachers don't believe that students are doing their work, that they're using AI, but students don't believe that teachers are doing their work anymore. Students think, well, my teacher has graded this paper, my paper is with AI. They've developed their tests with AI. They developed their lesson plans with AI. And once a colleague of mine who runs kind of the educational system in Canada says, once you've broken down the trust in both directions between teachers and students, that is a fundamental breakdown in the educational system. And that really hit me as a college professor myself to think, wow, I mean, it's going to be really hard to have a trusting, safe educational environment if everyone in the room believes that AI has done everything in the room.
That's really concerning because education is really a social process. It's about learning together and bidirectional learning. So if you lose trust, that's sort of the foundation of the whole process.
Yeah.
There are many challenges that we're facing. There's a question here that somebody asks, and they have a son who has fetal alcohol syndrome disorder and ADHD, and a trauma history. And the school has a Chromebook, and he almost immediately loses what little control he has over his impulses and is resistant to giving up the device. And so this person's asking what resources are available for parents who need to advocate for less tech time at school, and maybe they should look at some of the withdrawal studies or other resources.
The tide is turning. A year ago, people were talking about phones in the classroom, but now I'm hearing a lot of parent groups are talking about getting all the devices out of the classroom. And we have data demonstrating that even on the school-issued device, kids are using it for all kinds of things they shouldn't be using it for, and they're being very distracted by other people doing that as using their screens as well. So I have heard about this. LA County, which I believe Miami-Dade may be very close second or third in terms of the size of school districts. So you all have a great opportunity, but LA County has just passed brand new regulations for their school district to start removing school issued screens, not entirely, but to put a lot more checks and balances in there and to really limit the ways in which it was being used. And interestingly, every time I visit an independent or private school, they tell me we're taking the devices back. Every time I visit a public school, they're saying we don't have the resources to lock down these devices, so it's out of our control. We can't take them back. And I'm really scared about the disparity that might be getting created there, where we're going to see this very big difference between schools with and without as many resources. So I'd look to LA. I think that's really, they're the first to really change the rules on school-issued devices that I know of.
Yeah. Yep. I really appreciated your illuminating the fact that the instructors find it difficult when their students are on devices. And, in my course, my fourth year course this year, I stopped and asked the students to close their devices, close their phones, because about a quarter of the class was on a phone. I said, I'm having a really hard time concentrating because I see you on your devices and there's no reason for you to be on the devices. If you need to, leave. But, I don't think we very often talk about that stress and, the fact that teachers are finding that difficult and we're losing that human interaction. That's so essential. Yeah.
100%. Students are usually very surprised when they hear from a teacher or professor that we can tell the difference between note-taking, which often involves a little bit of eye contact, looking down, and scrolling, which is more of a dead in the eyes kind of, expression as someone is just getting sucked into their screen. And it often is a little bit of holding up a mirror to a classroom and reminding them that while they're very engrossed in something, we are very aware and can very much see what's happening. And students in many ways have forgotten or never learned how to take notes. They figure if I can just record this or if I can just get your slides, then I've done my job by being present in class. And it's been interesting from a psychological science perspective to actually teach them the way in which we come to learn new information, the connection of new neuronal pathways to old neuronal pathways, and rephrasing the information in your own words in your notes, the function that serves, because a lot of kids say, well, I'm recording this, or I'm just following along on your slides. We've kind of lost the art of conversation, nuance, processing information, and a lot of that's necessary for education. So I can understand why so many school teachers in secondary ed would feel like, I'm not getting through to these kids. I'm not, I can see them checked out, and I'm standing here trying to help them, but we've just lost the thread of communication at this point.
No, it's really important, and I think it's so important to recognize that machines can't do what humans do, and you've just explained that so beautifully. I was involved in a robot project, a robot-human interaction project, and we looked at whether robots could de-escalate aggression or a crisis. And there's so many steps, as you've just talked about, in understanding the nuances in a conflict, a high conflict situation, that a computer could never do that. It accesses technology, accesses information, and regurgitates that, but it can't do that kind of social emotional processing that we as humans do. And I think it's important to highlight that. And the other thing that I think about quite a bit, and you've helped me so much through this presentation, and I can see that so many people are writing positive things in the chat. But one of the things I think about often is, what do young people really need to learn in the K to 12 years? What is it that's important for them? Because things are so different. So, I learned the periodic table, but I don't ever use that in my daily and if I needed it, I could access it instantly. And, maybe we need, as a society, to think, well, what are the skills that young people need to thrive in today's world and to move into the future? But those are big questions, and they can't be answered by the Melissa Institute today. But Mitch, it's been so wonderful to be part of this and hear your wisdom and the wonderful research that you and your colleagues are doing. And I just want to note that Michael Appman is on top of this research and sends really important notifications to those of us who are in the Melissa Institute, because this has been on his radar for years. So I imagine he's listening with great pride to what you've done today. So thank you so much. And I'll turn it over to Etiony.
Yeah, just, wonderful conversation. Great. So much to think and talk about. It makes me think that all of us are in part here because we have a greater aspiration for the creation of a world that is just, fair, and that promotes the conditions so that everybody can grow safely and thrive. Okay. You pointed out why the AI was developed. It is not for any of those reasons. It is to make money. That's it. So somewhere on a grave somewhere, Marx is turning around, and pointing the fingers. I told you so. And so the commitment to really continue to advocate for fair, just practices, humanizing practices, it's always been there, but it's us that has to do it, not the companies, and it might require some AI involvement in the sense of getting also technology on our side to help move the needle for the companies and for the users of this technology. But I don't have the solution, but I think I'm confident that somebody like you would be an important part of that conversation, because it requires technological sophistication combined with a good old tested commitment to promoting a better life for everybody, and which is what we have aimed to do at the Melissa Institute for 30 years. By the way, you have seen the in the chat information about a program that we have that is available at no cost to everybody who asked for it. It's called the Project Real USA. It's based on the work of our colleague and one of Debra's former students in the UK, Yvonne Skipper. And we have curriculum ready for you to take and use. We have an adaptation of the curriculum done in the US, and we'll continue to develop and really serve as technical assistant for anybody who wants to implement it in their schools, in after-school programs, anywhere. So if you're interested in that, take a look at that and reach out to us. We'll help you. Mitch, I want to give you a last minute to say anything that you have in your mind right now, and then before I just really send you a virtual hug, or what you do.
I just want to say thank you so much to the Melissa Institute and to all of you for everything that you're doing for kids. Thank you so much for the opportunity to present. For anyone that feels disheartened or hopeless with the information out there, which I know it can have that effect, we are the customers, we are the parents, we are the ones with the power. We can put the phone down, we can encourage others to do so. We can band together to take a break for a minute, an hour, a day, and we ultimately can make this change. And everyone that listens and talks with others about it is taking a positive step in reclaiming our humanity and our connection together again. Thank you so much for the opportunity to chat with you all this morning.